Welcome to the Digital Agency Growth Podcast. I'm your host, Dan Englander. Dan, nice to have you on the show.
Really great to be here, Dan.
Yeah. And this is we're both Dan's, and also I think this is a local podcast. You're not too far from me in the Upper West Side, it sounds like.
That's right. Yeah, in the Upper West Side today. You're in Brooklyn, right?
I was in Brooklyn. I actually am in the Upper West Side as well. So.
Oh, cool. All right. Even more reason we should get together soon.
Yeah, we should have done it in person, but oh well, this works as well. So it's great to have you on, like I mentioned, and I think that we like to get as many far-reaching perspectives as we can on sales and new business, which is my core competency. It sounds like yours too, although none of this exists in a vacuum. It touches everything else, as you know. So before we get into that, if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about your background and kind of how you got to where you are with MindRacer.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm originally from Yorkshire in the UK. I've been in the States since 2008. I actually got into digital agencies very, very early. So when Google Ads were brand new, I joined an agency that had transferred from just being a web development shop to selling Google Ads. And we were selling to people who'd never advertised on a search engine. They didn't know they could. That's how early it was. Then we started selling SEO, and that business became one of the top 3 agencies in the UK. So we had a really great time. I was on the sales side, cut my teeth as what they call an SDR these days, working for the sales director, and then quickly grew my own team, built that. Then I left that business. They actually exited for a very healthy sum. And I was hired by a private investment group to help launch and accelerate their businesses in marketing and information industries, which were really blowing up as well. So my first managing director role was actually launching a tech product for them, which we now see everywhere. It's digital signage, right? You walk into a building and it tells you where to go for your meeting or where to go for the conference rooms or whatever. That was innovative back then. So we were taking that to lots of different businesses. I got the opportunity to move to Boston from then. I was in London at the time. So to accelerate a content marketing agency business. So again, back in the agency world. And that did very well because at that point, a lot of people were trying to invest in SEO. They wanted content for their website. They wanted it to be original. I built a sales team from me to 47 people within that agency. And that built up a lot of scar tissue and a lot of experience for me in trying to find the right places to focus people, trying to find the right way to organize sales teams, trying to find technology to support all of that. And that did well. Very well. We got to 61 on the Inc. list. And then I actually then used the data that we gained from that to identify a new market segment, and then spun a new agency out of that and took a new segment and built that to 60 people, multi-million-dollar revenue inside 2 years. So lots of experience in the sort of launching and accelerating of revenue, both on the salesperson, sales leadership, and then on the managing director and CEO side. So that after that, I'd got where I thought I was trying to get to and took a bit of a break. And my guidance for anybody who's going to take a break after leaving an agency is have a plan, because I didn't. And what I mean by that is I spent 6 months traveling the world, and it was kind of cool, but it was a bit lonely because I was doing it on my own. And I didn't really have a plan of what I wanted to do next. And I thought, well, hang on, what can I do next? I've been lucky enough to be given a green card, permanent residency in the US. So I moved to New York City and started a 1099 consulting business, just giving away my time for a couple of people, then monetizing it, then beginning to work with more founders. And again, it was in that accelerating their sales or helping them launch their sales for tech businesses or for service businesses. And then as I refined that playbook, I recognized I could help a lot more people if I started actually building a business. So really, that's where MindRacer came from. It was sort of right, I've got a lot of good career experience. I've done things from the early stage to the acceleration stage. I've seen businesses get to exit. How can I help people who want to achieve those things? Because I didn't have my own startup idea that I wanted to go and change the world with. And so this is my way of trying to help a whole lot of different people. And so now we've got a diverse team of people that we bring in for different industries and specialties. And we work on revenue operations in terms of the technology, and we work on strategy and supporting teams to get things done, to transform to the next level.
That's great. And there's so much to dig into there. I guess one question is, so, you got to this level and you took some time off and so on, and you kind of wish that you had a plan. If you were going back then, what would that plan have looked like?
I think it would have been either develop a specific skill set or find 2 or 3 people to collaborate on a business with, or specifically fulfill this particular travel agenda within a particular period of time, and then move on to the next thing. And as I've consulted with many, many CEOs who are about to exit or have just exited, and they're sort of trying to soul search and work out what to do next. I mean, so last year, so many of our clients exited their businesses and they were so focused on the exit. And I said, just remember, make a plan for what you're going to do afterward, right? And it's really very interesting that a lot of them just think it's going to be okay. And you don't realize how much of your identity is wrapped up in the role. So, if you're a founder or you're a CEO or whatever you are, you've got a whole lot of that as part of your DNA. When you introduce yourself, you're probably going to be part of that in a lot of business situations. And then that's gone.
Right.
And so, what are you trying to do next? That was the thing that if I could zoom back in, I've now got a couple of books that I recommend to people. I've got, I'll sit down with them and I'll say, okay, how long is it going to be until you want to be doing something again? A lot of people think a year's right amount of time. That's a long time.
Yeah. And in my experience talking with people that have exited, there's definitely that, emotional element and everything. They're not just emotional, but you're an identity element that goes along with it. But then there's also the sort of like logistical element where you've now converted this thing where you have all these resources, right? And you go on vacation and maybe you're finding a way to expense that. You want to contact somebody about something ancillary to the business, but now you have this network related to the business that can get you there. And now all that gets converted into this big pile of cash that's kind of just like blowing around in the wind. So, I guess to kind of bring this to what you're doing at MindRacer, can you go into that a little bit? Like when when you're bringing on a new client, and I know you're focusing on tech and the agency space, but what does that typically look like? What are you doing with them on day 1 versus day 50 and so on?
Yeah, good question. So there's 3 main transformations that we will work with teams. So that all of the founders that we work with are the ones who've decided that they're not the ones who have to figure everything out. Right? There's 2 different types of CEO. One is the one who says, "I'm going to try and figure everything out. I'm going to hire I'm going to bring in people who can figure everything out." And then there's a CEO who's like, "I know, I just need to hire people who are going to help me get there." And we work with that second CEO. So that's an immediate filter is, somebody who's decided that they want to grow, they're going to invest and they're going to get the right help to get there. Now, once they're in that mindset, we help them transform. The first one is from a founder-led to a professional sales team. The second one is from slow or no growth to an accelerating sales engine. And the third one, which has happened a lot more over the last couple of years, is transitioning from an intuition-driven business to a data-driven business. And that's really, really interesting as well. Now, that's actually a foundation of most businesses that are going to go fast, but sometimes it stands on its own as an initial project.
Yeah, that's interesting. So going from founder led to professional sales team, let's start there. So what's the situation on the ground? Like if you can, I guess sum it up into revenues, that's helpful. Usually what stage are people at and how have they kind of like gotten to that level at the point at which they need to start thinking about a professional sales team?
Yeah, so generally the value of somebody's network ends up being between $2 and $3 million annual revenue. And once they get to that $2 to $3 million annual revenue, they've normally tapped out everyone they know who knows somebody, and they've got to the point where then their revenue is not going any further unless they build something which is a commercialized sales team. Now, of course, there are exceptions to that, but that's what we've generally seen. Some people it's a lot lower. Some people get stuck at 500K and they just can't get past it because they either don't know people who are in the market for it, they haven't worked out how to tell the story, whatever that is. So that's the range. Generally between $500,000 and about $3 million is the founder gets stuck, they become the bottleneck, and they need somebody to help them visualize what life looks like with them not being involved in every deal. And then actually to help them visualize what a team might look like in the future, and then to work out what the milestones are to get there. And I think your audience will recognize this, and you certainly will in the business that you're in. Often the founder will make the wrong hire early to try and get them to the point where they can just give that person all the responsibility of doing it. And actually, the reality of it is that the founder needs to first surround themselves with people who can accelerate them and then begin to take things off of them, rather than just bringing somebody in who's run a sales team before to build a sales team. You've actually got to be able to build the component parts of it around the founder. And that's quite challenging the first time you do it. It's challenging the second time you do it. I can tell you we've done it many tens of times, and it's always hard because the founder usually bakes the cake in their head and they know roughly what the ingredients are. But when you try and describe it to somebody else, it doesn't come out in an organized fashion. And so you've got to be able to take that apart over a period of time. And that depends on how long the sales cycle is. But we support the founder while they go through that process.
Yeah, and to kind of compare notes on that, I've seen different manifestations or versions of the founder kind of stepping out of a sales role. I'm actually going through that right now myself, so this is super timely for me. But my first sales role was a founder that actually got out, I think, very early. And this has kind of been the exception to the rule that I've noticed in my experience. But the thing that he had nailed was he became a wizard with Google Ads, or it was AdWords at the time, right? So he really got that figured out. And he was, kind of an introvert, close friend of mine to this day. He just didn't want to be involved in sales, allergic to it, didn't want to do it, but he figured out inbound very early and then plugged me into it, and then we kept going from there, and it went pretty well. But since then, kind of working with a lot of agencies, I've found usually it's the situation that you mentioned where things have kind of been built on the networks or the Rolodexes of one owner or maybe two partners, and then it's a much rougher transition, right? Because there's no frame of comparison. It's kind of just like, well, I've sort of made this work by flying by the seat of my pants. Now we've got to do this other thing. So with that in mind, is there a framework? Is there like a single or a couple different ways to do this right? Is it sort of like if you're at 2 million-ish, you should go to hire this particular role? Or are you agnostic on that? Like, how do you think about that sort of hire?
So if you think about, let's bring things down to the simplest possible way of talking about them, right? So you've got simpler sales and you've got complex sales. And the simpler sales generally tend to be ones where they have a more transactional nature, a quicker sales cycle, a lower deal value. You do more of them to build up your revenue. Then you've also got the more complex sales, and you might call those enterprise sales depending, but that label's always a bit less than defined in these early stages. What they mean generally is this is a big client to us. And so your level of that might be 100,000 or more, it might be 500,000 or more, depends on the complexity of the business. I work with businesses that had short sales cycles in just a few $1,000s average order value. We've worked with businesses that have got millions of dollars on their average order value. So the two projects are completely different. We're working with a services company right now that has a very, very high technology product. The founders are engineers and absolute geniuses in what they're doing. It's a very timely thing in that it's a climate technology type of product. And there's a lot of education that needs to happen as part of the sales process. But then you need to be able to help the founder to surround that with a sales process that makes sense. There needs to be a nurture in there. The founder doesn't want to do that. They don't want to be seen to be following up and pushing information at people when they should be dazzled by the brilliance of the product. And that's something that you would immediately start to design and then begin to steadily roll out, right? On the other side of that, if it's a very transactional product, then really you want the founder to have as many leads as possible so that they can show other people how they are running the sales process, map out what the sales process looks like as it goes from their head to normally lucid chart in our world. We like to have the workflow diagrams, and then start to build that into, if you're very early, maybe it's even a spreadsheet with some stages in it, and then agree what the stages are to get from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3 to stage 4. Just having somebody who's done that many, many, many times before makes the process flow really quickly. That could be done in a workshop in a half a day with a small business that has a relatively quick turnover. If it's got a much more complicated sales process, it may take a little bit longer, but we're still talking about like a couple of weeks to get to something that makes sense before you actually start then knowing what your next milestones are. And anyone who's taking much longer than that to have that initial design of what it looks like is doing too much research, because we're still going into a hypothesis, prove it, test it, edit it, type of a process, right? So
Yeah.
that's why what we do is we've got 15 VPs now, VPs or CROs, depending on their level of experience, who've actually got industry experience. They speak the language of the buyer and the seller. They know what these types of complex or simple deals look like. And that's one of the things that we do is we match the founder with somebody who's been through it before, help them download that really quickly and build a plan. And then they may not need that level of experience and cost to drive it. They may just then need somebody who's experienced at overseeing a sales process like that to actually help them run it. And that's one of the flexibilities that we quite enjoy, is to be able to say, right, we've got rich experience in helping them design strategy, but then when it comes to actually getting it done, you don't necessarily need somebody who's going to be the highest level of experience to support the founder. The founder has to want to grow. The founder has to be open to collaborating in that way. But that's how you would look at those two separate types of opportunities.
That makes sense. And to dig into that more, so kind of thinking about that workshop phase, I think one thing that I've noticed in the agency space, and maybe this happens in SaaS too, but it seems like to maybe a lesser degree, is there's just so many more variables than a typical, or comparable business, right? Because you have an agency that might have a half dozen verticals they work with, they might have a half dozen services, and then you have the usual issues with a founder kind of making this work and having an undocumented sort of process for so long. So when somebody's in that situation, they're like, oh, we know we've sold to technology companies, we sell to education, we sell to government, we do web services, we do ads, we do this. Yeah, we sold more of this, but this market seems to be better right now over the next 5 years. How do you constrain that? Like, what does that workshop look like to get somebody to develop that process and sort of start to delegate it or teach it and that kind of thing?
So let's make some assumptions here in order to make sure that we're on a similar starting point. So we've got a client list. Clients have paid X amount of money. We've got an identified list of people who are the buyers within those clients. We can work out what their title is and how many years of experience they've got. We can also work out what industries they're in, potentially what technologies they use. And so you end up with quite a decent profile of people who have bought from you before. Then we have a conversation with whoever's there on the team. If it's a very small team, this can be very productive very, very quickly. And we can work out what are the reasons why people actually bought from us. Now, you hear a lot of stories here about why people think that they bought from us. And that's why it's important to talk to each of the stakeholders. So a good example would be the person who closed the deal and the person who delivered the work. They're going to tell you two different sides of the same story. And it's really important to actually bring all that together and be able to actually look at that and say, okay, is this the best available information? Because it's unlikely at that very early stage that you're going to have absolutely outstanding CRM history and a whole lot of inbound traffic to validate what's coming in and what's not, and a really extensive outbound campaign history to be able to validate which the response rates are the best. It probably doesn't exist at that very early stage. So what we do then is look at what's happening in the market, right? So there's a lot of fear out there at the moment. There's a lot of slowdown in certain industries. There are always going to be industries that are not massively affected by slowdowns. And do we think there's a reasonable risk for us going into X, Y, or Z sector? So we should deprioritize those for right now. And which ones do we think are going to be the best things for us to invest in? Which are the best bets for us to actually focus on right now? And what we have is we have a prioritization matrix. And so once we've decided who the client is that we're going to be able to meet the demand and hit their pain points, and what is going to be the best market conditions right now based upon what we can research quickly and see, then we're a small business. We're going to agree what the right direction forward is going to be. Then we're going to prioritize the strategies that we think are going to be the biggest impact to go and get. And that in the same workshop is very important to be able to review from our experience of working in those industries and from their experience of working in those industries and the actual skill set of the existing team. And this is something that gets overlooked so often. People are like, oh, well, the best way of going and getting these businesses to do something we've absolutely never done before, and we should do it as much as possible, and we should devote all our resources to something we don't know how to do. Versus, here's something that we've done before successfully, but we just haven't focused on it at the moment. We're trying to do 9 other things. And often with those very small teams, we can find 2 or 3 things that they can focus on that are going to have an impact, that are going to be easier to execute for their existing team, and therefore are the best things for that team to do now. Now, that's just a real common sense approach, gathering data and then prioritizing things for that team. And it's very, very rare that businesses will run that sort of review for themselves. And so that's one of the things that's really great about being able to say, right, we've got this toolkit, we do this, this is the outcome of it, is clarity. We
Right.
worked with an agency a couple of weeks ago, a couple of $1 million revenue, having a tough time. They were trying to execute 11 different things, and we got them down to 3, and now they're pushing forward. Previously, we've done it with a small, let's say a team of 7 on the revenue side, trying to execute, I'm not exaggerating here, trying to execute 17 strategies with one marketer, a couple of people on the actual revenue team, channel and a salesperson, and then the senior team. Between those people, are trying to do 17 things.
Right.
There's absolutely no way they could do them well. And so when we started to get them to focus on those things, guess what? They were doing less things, but they were doing them better. And they were timed for what's going on in the market. So actually, in that case, their revenue 5x'd in the next 12 months. And then off we went from there. So
Yeah.
keep it simple.
That makes a lot of sense. And I agree with you when it comes to being there longer, thinking a little bit longer term to become, a specialist in a particular area so that you can get hired there. I think what seems to be tougher is prioritizing a certain vertical based on what the market's doing, because for one, there's uncertainty. Uncertainty is not risk, because risk implies there's some way to measure it. There's no way to know what a particular market's going to do over the next 12 months. And also the people that are going to win or lose in a market have already probably gotten their foothold there. At the same time, you kind of have to balance that with the fact that there's markets that are definitely growing and ones that are definitely going to be shrinking, like big box retail probably shrinking, and then digital, growing or whatever by and large. So let's talk about that a little bit. And this, I may not bring this to a very good question, but how are you thinking about the recession or handling that with clients when it comes to picking a market or anything and everything else?
Yeah. I mean, in challenging market conditions, there are a lot of opportunities. And the biggest opportunities happen because all of your competitors stop pushing. They stop advertising, so advertising costs go down. They stop hiring and building sales teams, so the amount of available talent goes up. They stop pushing for the deals that are, out there because they're just trying to minimize their risks and trying to deliver what they've already got. The fear affects your competitor as much as it affects anybody else. And so that's something to remember as a founder, is that, if you've got a real confidence and a real competency in an industry that is obviously not decimated right now, then that could be a real thing to consider as a priority. How could you take advantage of the fact that that industry, maybe you serve healthcare, maybe you serve utilities, maybe you serve the federal government, maybe you serve law enforcement or financial services, those sorts of businesses, and financial services absolutely does go up during these sorts of times, but different products go up versus others, right? People travel on a lower budget after COVID. They travel at a high budget after COVID because they want to have experiences, but during recession, they travel at a lower budget. They still want to go and do things, but they just don't want to risk as much money. IT is always going to be an area of investment for businesses that are trying to grow. There's loads of industries there that you can actually go and make progress in. And so if you have competency there, and during the 08-09 recession, we looked at all of the data from all of the different industries that we'd been prospecting to, and we were selling to pretty much any business with a modern website at the time and giving them content. We recognized that these were the 5 main industries that we were going to bring down. And I won't share what they were because it's confidential to the other businesses model, but we focused most of our resources on going and getting more of those. What happened? The conversion rate from meeting to deal went up 225%. The average order value increased 40% because we just used the same resources, but we focused them. Now the business blew up. We ended up at 61 on the Inc. list. Now, more recent example, during COVID, working with a business that was a little bit confused. They were too broad in the things that they were trying to do. They were selling to pharma and education and home services and all sorts of stuff like that. Help them focus on 1 or 2 really core businesses where they had great partnerships, great relationships, and access to resources through their partners, and they blew up during that period of time. So now, again, we're looking for those same sorts of opportunities within the business. What's the current competencies that are really good? Where have they got the best partnerships? And what can they do to leverage what's already there?
Right. And
to
I think,
actually move things forward.
sorry, yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just going to say, I think the other angle is that especially for agencies, but also for software companies too, a lot of the times the next best option that you're being compared to is a hire, right? And a long-term hire makes a lot less sense during a recession, I think, than a fractional team. At least that's something that we see and kind of see among our clients. But what are your thoughts on that?
I actually think there's a timeline for the relationship with a business. And so, if you're a service provider, like many of us are, there's a particular time in a business's life cycle where it would use a service like ours in order to get from A to B, figuratively, right? Something happens before that. Maybe they're going to hire a freelancer and try and manage them. And then they're going to say, look, we need something a bit more mature, but we're not ready to have an internal team. So they work with a services business to get them to the next level. And then there's going to be a tipping point where that business is ready to say, right now, we need an internal team for whatever reason.
Right.
And understanding as a service business owner what your piece of the life cycle looks like is vital, because you need to know what the signs of progression off are when you're likely to transition a client, and what the signs of progression are to begin to win a client. And if you know those two bookends for your piece on the timeline, you can actually network really effectively with businesses that can provide services on the before and after side.
Yeah.
So, if you're looking at a business that you start working after a group of freelancers, well, guess what? You can go and get referrals from a whole bunch of freelancers who, as I say, right, okay, they're looking for an agency. Then afterward, if you're looking at what we do, if we're looking at building out a professional sales team for a business, then of course they're going to need a sales leader at the end of that. So we know businesses that can help them to either run a search process or help them with that next level. And then as a business owner, we want to continue leaving value for a client, even after we've done our main project. So all business owners should think in this way. What's the thing that could support the next stage, even if it's not our primary service? And again, I was working with an agency a couple of weeks ago. They'll go in and do their initial project, a couple of $100,000, very, very nice, thank you. And then they'll finish when they're done. And we said to them, well, hang on a minute. Is there not a service or a software or a program or a dashboard or something that you can introduce to these guys that they're going to get value from in the longer term, that gives you the opportunity to go back in and do quarterly business reviews with them and get some recurring revenue from that product? And they're like, oh, never thought of that. So long answer.
Yeah, no,
but
that makes sense. I definitely agree with the life cycle hypothesis to this stuff. I just wonder if maybe certain bigger companies will stay at the lower life cycle for longer during a recession before deciding to build a team in-house or take on a lot more risk and that kind of thing. So maybe there's gold in them hills, but maybe not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's entirely subjective to what the actual service is, right? Like, for example,
Sure.
An outsourced software team may just be providing outstanding value on an ongoing basis, and they're very happy doing that. And they're already experiencing enough challenges with internal teams recruiting. They just want to stay working with that software partner. Marketing may be the same.
Yeah.
I think that there is always going to be a transition point where you get off of it. But knowing where that is, I don't think it's much different during a recession.
Sure.
Experience.
Fair enough. And on that note, I think the fact that you're working with software is super interesting. And, I think a lot of people in the service business kind of think of software as like this golden cow, right? Where it's like such a better business. And then the more and more data I get, and I think I was reading a really good article by Jason Cohen, who runs Smart Bear, which is a great blog. And he's talking about the numbers behind, I don't quote me on this because I might have it wrong, but I think it was like Salesforce and some other major, enterprise software companies. And once you factor in the fact that, like, by and large, the sort of 80-20 of their business are a small number of large accounts, not your everyday small business, but actually like a few big enterprise accounts. And the fact that those need salespeople, those need accounts people, those need all these other things. The numbers actually aren't a lot different from like a pretty well-run service business. So I'd love to hear your perspective on that and just kind of how your software clients differ from your service clients and how you're thinking about this.
Well, I mean, the biggest difference is the valuation on the exit multiple based upon the
True.
revenue.
True. Yeah.
There's an enormous difference that is unquestionable when it comes to MRR valuations on SaaS versus the service business revenue, even when you've got really strong GP and you've got consistent growth over 5 years and you've got 12 months of advance of pipeline
Yeah.
and previous bookings, the
Agreed.
valuations you're going to get are planetary different from one another.
Agreed. I was saying that more as getting to a software business isn't always as rosy as it seems, I guess, is kind of like my argument there. Yeah.
Okay. In terms of the question of whether a business should build software
In
and
terms of what
service
it
it,
takes, not whether you should do it or not, because I think it definitely makes sense to do it based on the things we're talking about in terms of the exits and the valuations and all that. But what I was surprised to find is just the amount of service that these software businesses require these days. And the fact that it seems like a lot of software businesses actually seem to be heading more towards a more service-like direction in different ways.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So one of the projects that I undertook early on when I started consulting was to help a marketing technology business, specifically an email marketing provider, who had got stuck at a certain revenue level, or about $2.5 million annual revenue. And a big part of their business was actually helping people set up those email automations, right? So, you can buy a platform, but it doesn't do anything out of the box. And you've got to be able to actually help your new customer to set things up. And you've got to be able to say, we're going to help you with your migration from one system to another. You've got to be able to say that you're going to help them in the event that they have a problem with deliverability or whatever that would be. And there's a whole lot of services there that require project management and setup and potentially design and so on. And if you looked at that and said, this is just a software business, then you wouldn't have the full picture. Then there's a lot of software businesses out there that do require a lot of implementation and a lot of services to get businesses across the line and get them actually using it. Because the biggest problem with software businesses is when someone buys it and then they don't actually roll it out and use it within their team. The usage metrics are very low. And that, as a customer success viewpoint, is incredibly dangerous because you're going to have incredible high churn. So the similarities there are quite strong, right? So if you're running a service business effectively, you're having regular touch points with the client, you understand what their quarterly business review opportunities look like, so you can keep moving and helping them achieve more things over time. And a lot of software businesses are like that. Not micro SaaS, where it's $39 a month and you use it or you don't use it. But if we're talking about software businesses in the many thousands of dollars a month, services around them, they do have a services division within them. So, service business owners would have a good skill set there for making that business run well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And to kind of circle back to something you mentioned earlier. So you talked about opportunities in the recession, the idea of building this process and kind of consolidating a lot of things through a prioritization metric. One thing that you mentioned was the difficulty in sales hiring and how a lot of your clients get that wrong. Can you talk about that a little bit? Like, what are those things that you see over and over again? I think one thing that I think Tim Ferriss asked a lot is like, if you could put one thing on a billboard to get people to stop doing something or start doing something, what might that look like? If that's an easy enough question to answer.
Yeah, it really is. And the most common thing that happens when a founder's building out a sales team around them is they bring in somebody who's got experience running a much more mature sales team. And they're more of a maintenance manager on a product that's got high brand awareness, a lot of users already, and they've been running a system that's already very well developed. And the founder sees that as somebody who knows what they're doing, and they're going to be very low risk because they've been doing that and they've had however many millions of dollars of revenue as their responsibility. That person doesn't necessarily have the skill set or the awareness that they need the skill set to help get all that information out of a founder's head. And often when you've worked in a very large organization, probably many of the agency owners that we're that are listening to this will resonate with this. When you've worked in a much larger business, you're surrounded by all these different resources. And then you go and you start your own thing and you realize how many things were getting done for you, from bookkeeping to invoicing to, analytics reviews, all sorts of different stuff like that. Now, all of a sudden, you're doing everything yourself. Quite the same, really, going from being a VP or an SVP of sales at a larger business and coming to work alongside a founder. You're out of your depth for the first year. And, that's a big problem because most of these businesses can't afford a high sales salary without the performance for a whole year while that person figures it out. Might be 6 months if you're lucky. They might fail. And most often, unfortunately, they agree that there's not a fit after a relatively short period of time. And then the founder ends up with the scar tissue because they're like, well, I thought I had a good person last time. They were supposed to be a good salesperson. I don't know what went wrong. And then they end up in this stall stage for a period of time that costs them probably millions of dollars. Because if you're not growing, then you're not going to make the money. If you're not investing in having somebody set up the sales process, the opportunity cost is huge. And we're all human. So unfortunately, when we've made a mistake like that and it's cost us a lot of money, sometimes it takes a while to lick our wounds and get back after it. And that is the most common thing. So I would say billboard is stop hiring the wrong people, but the wrong person is a little bit hard to decide when you've not done it before. So we use the scorecard.
Makes sense. And I think we've both run into that a lot with clients. And usually, we're involved in figuring out the top of the funnel for clients first so that they can stair step out, right? So they can get the meetings to build the process so they can hire the person in that closing seat and that sort of thing. And yeah, I've been on a lot of conversations with people where it's like, we've hired 3 salespeople, none of them worked. And it turns out what usually happens is they send them out off into the cold with, the portfolio and a deck. And then 6 months later, 12 months later, they come back with nothing. So it takes building processes and it ain't easy, as we both know. So Dan, kind of getting towards the end of our interview here, there's a new segment that we've rolled out in the last few weeks called Overrated, Underrated. And what I'll do is I'm going to throw out a phrase or a topic related to what we're talking about here. You let us know overrated, underrated, or properly rated, and why, in your opinion. It'll be a little bit of a lightning round. Are you ready?
I guess so, yeah.
Cool. First one, using recruiters to source salespeople.
Properly rated.
Why?
Well, recruiters can be incredibly powerful at accelerating a process. If you're in an industry that's difficult to get a specific skill set, and you need to find people who've got that specific skill set, and you've got a recruiter who knows a load of those people and can move somebody for you quickly, that's a really good investment.
Makes sense. Meeting in person in the sales context, let's say.
Well, I rate that highly in the value it provides, but actually, unless you're in the enterprise, you can get a lot of things done in those sort of more transactional sales on Zoom. So contextually, I'd say if you're just looking to drive numbers, then you don't need to meet people in person. If you're looking to develop relationships and work your way into larger accounts, I would say that they need to be happening. So what is that, properly rated?
It's a good answer. It's okay if the structure breaks a little sometimes. That's fine. Let's say sales role playing exercises in the context of training.
Underrated. I think they need to happen regularly. One of the most important parts of coaching is to give somebody the space to unpack how they would do something differently and then role play it with them to help them contextualize it in their head before they go off and try to do it. Very, very valuable.
Makes sense. Inspirational seminars.
Properly rated in that I think they're good. Everybody can benefit. Well, I think most people can benefit from getting a fresh perspective and then going and applying it from time to time. Small percentage of people don't need it, but I feel like the boost that you get from going to something like that and then going and taking that energy forward is a valuable investment for me and for people who have that same sort of energy. So from my perspective, properly rated in that it's positive.
Makes sense. Yeah. SDRs in the context of like an enterprise or complex sales situation.
Vital.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So let me qualify here. So when you've got people who have relationships and they can get that initial conversation, and they are they're a very high experienced salesperson, very, very, very powerful to be able to get those person to have those conversations. But then also don't forget, when you're in a large account, a massive tech company, the SDR can then support all of the other people in that massive company who your first person with the Rolodex doesn't know. So you're already in there, and then you can use your SDR to mine into the account and go and get many more conversations based upon the fact that the first one happened. So it may not be the first door knock that you use that SDR for, but it can be a really good partnership with your account exec who really knows the account and can tell that SDR what to go and do and who to go and talk to. That can work really well.
Makes sense. I mean, you could probably do a whole episode on that, which is interesting. So
Yeah.
yeah. So the last one for now, lead nurturing.
Underrated. I mean, I don't see it done thoroughly very often. Yeah, we're mostly working with businesses that are doing less than 100 million in revenue, often smaller than that, much smaller than that. As I said, we're starting with people who've got like 500,000 up to 3 million for the founder plus. They haven't done it. They haven't really set it up. Businesses that have got a small sales team, they don't really have an extensive marketing department. They're not doing a lot of it, but when they do, they start seeing results from it. Lead nurturing leads to lead scoring, which leads to better marketing qualified leads, which means you get better sales qualified leads and prioritization on the people that you've actually got to do the work that needs to be done. So it saves you a whole lot once you've set it up. You've got to be at the right point to implement it and be able to do so affordably. So I think it's underrated in that not enough people are doing it and it needs to be done more. But I think that's why.
Great. That makes sense. I think there's so much else we could cover, and hopefully we'll do it again before long. Dan, thank you so much for your time. How can people follow what you're up to, get in touch, and all that good stuff?
Yeah, sure. So our website is mindracerconsulting.com. And on there are a couple of white papers that cover off things like how to successfully hire and ramp up your first salesperson. So that can be a really good resource for people who are interested in seeing that. Also, I post regularly on LinkedIn. You can find me, Dan Morris. And so, yeah, I would look forward to engaging with people out there on the social channels, and always happy to answer some questions as they come across from your listeners.
Awesome, Dan. Thanks again. Really appreciate it. And there are some other great tools that you mentioned that we'll make sure to get linked up as well. And thanks for joining everyone on the Digital Agency Growth Podcast.